For 18 months, she watched a man take everything she built, her research, her framework, her name, and present it to the world as his own. And every single time, she said nothing, because silence was the only currency she had left that hadn't been stolen yet. Then a Korean researcher she barely knew stood up in a room of 60 of the most powerful people in her field, said her name out loud, and refused to sit back down until every person in that room understood exactly what had been taken from her. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that he had been privately protecting her name for weeks before that moment, before she knew his face, before she knew his voice, before she knew that the quiet, precise man taking notes in her university's annex building was the head of one of Korea's most powerful crime organizations, and that a man who had built an empire on knowing exactly who holds power and who is being robbed of it was never going to sit in that room and say nothing. He had already decided she wasn't going to disappear. She just didn't know yet what kind of man had made that decision. If that kind of story is why you're here, you're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story, and stay with us, because this one is only just beginning. She wasn't supposed to find him. She had gone to the third floor looking for an empty room, somewhere quiet, somewhere she could sit with the weight of what she'd seen on her laptop screen without it pressing down on her in front of other people. What she found instead was a door propped open with a rubber wedge, and through it, a man standing at a whiteboard with his back to her, writing in Korean. She almost kept walking. Then she saw what he was writing, and her feet stopped moving completely. The left column, phonological transcriptions, dense and structured, running top to bottom in 2 careful rows. The right column, a breakdown of prosodic patterning she recognized the way you recognize your own face in an unexpected reflection, startled, then certain. The theoretical layer connecting those 2 columns, the framework mapping boundary patterns across the Korean text, that wasn't his. That was hers. Not her published work, her unpublished draft. The version she had presented at last month's colloquium. The one she had spent a semester developing. The one that her supervisor had sat in the back row taking notes on before submitting it to a major international symposium under his own name 3 weeks later. Her voice found itself before her brain caught up. That's a modified version of boundary marking theory from the Creole prosody paper. He turned. She had expected. She didn't know what she'd expected. Embarrassment? Maybe. Defensiveness. The carefully managed expression of someone caught in something they needed to explain away. What she got instead were eyes that assessed her with an immediacy that made every other form of eye contact she'd received in this building feel, by comparison, like a polite performance. He was tall, angular rather than imposing, like a structure built for function that happened to be beautiful as a consequence. Clean jaw, sharp cheekbones, dark eyes that didn't waver. He wore the slightly rumpled certainty of someone who had been working for hours and had not once paused to wonder how he appeared while doing it. He said in English that carried the residue of Korean at its edges, "You wrote that paper." Not a question, a statement, as if he had been waiting for her to walk through that door. "I presented it," Delara said carefully, because that was the only honest thing she could say right now about her relationship to her own work. "You were at the colloquium?" "I was in the back. I left before the reception." A pause, and then, without breaking eye contact, "The framework is more versatile than you suggested in your conclusion. I have been testing it on Korean tonal boundary patterns for the past 3 weeks." She stepped fully into the room, because that was either the most presumptuous thing anyone had said to her in a year and a half, or it was the most genuinely engaged response to her research she had received since she had stopped expecting genuinely engaged responses. She needed to know which one it was. "Show me," she said. His name was Seo Wonsok. He spelled it when she asked, which she noted. He was a visiting research fellow on a one-year appointment from Seoul National University's linguistics faculty, where he specialized in acoustic phonetics and the syntax-phonology interface. He was, in other words, precisely the right person to be testing her framework on Korean tonal data. And the results he had already generated, right there on the board in front of her, were genuinely illuminating. She had been in this building for 18 months, and no one had done this with her work. Not engaged with it, not extended it, not treated it as a living intellectual structure worth inhabiting. And here was this man, this stranger, who had been quietly doing all of that for 3 weeks in a room she had never thought to walk into. "Your boundary strength hierarchy," he said, pointing to the right column. "You propose a 3-tier model. But in Seoul Korean, particularly conversational registers among speakers over 50, there appears to be a 4th tier, an ultra-weak boundary that functions almost as a prosodic hedge, marking social deference without completing a full prosodic unit." Delara set her bag down without thinking about it and moved closer to the board. A social pragmatic function embedded directly in the prosodic structure. "Yes." He glanced at her sideways. "Which your framework predicts, if you extend the presuppositions in your 3rd section. You did not extend them yourself." "I was constrained by my data set," she said. "Caribbean English varieties only." "The extension is natural. The logic is already there." She stared at the board. He was right. She had been too close to see it. And this man, this stranger who had appeared from nowhere, had found it in 3 weeks, by simply following where her thinking led. She had almost forgotten that was possible, that someone could read her work and follow it somewhere, instead of dismantling it, diminishing it, or quietly removing her name from it. She picked up a dry erase marker from the tray without asking permission and wrote a question in the margin of his left column. He went very still for half a second. Then he looked at what she had written, and for the first time since she had walked into the room, he smiled. Small, contained, like a flame behind glass. "That," he said, "is exactly the problem I have not been able to solve." What Delara Voss did not know, what she had no way of knowing, was that on the other side of the world the name Seo Wonsok meant something very— 4 hours passed without either of them. 4 hours passed without either of them noticing. The afternoon light shifted from gold to gray, and at some point Wonsok got up without comment and switched on the fluorescence, and Delara barely registered it because she was mid-argument about the distributional properties of the ultra-weak boundary tier. He let her finish. Completely. No interruption, no overlap, no talking over the end of her sentence to begin his own. He simply waited until her thought was whole, and then he responded to all of it. She had been shortening her arguments for so long, compressing them preemptively, cutting the full version down to what she estimated she'd be allowed to finish before someone stepped in, that hearing herself make the unabridged version felt strange, like hearing a song played at its actual tempo after months of slowed-down recordings. Then his phone buzzed on the table between them. He glanced at the screen. 1 line of Korean, sender name redacted. His expression didn't change. Not a flicker, not a shift. But he turned the phone face down with a precision that was somehow more deliberate than ignoring it would have been. Delara registered it, filed it, said nothing. "What is your source for that claim?" he asked, exactly as if the phone had not buzzed at all. She told him. He listened. They kept working. Here is what Delara Voss did not understand about the man across the whiteboard from her. The reason he could identify the architecture of a theft so quickly, so precisely, so without hesitation, was that Seo Wonsok had spent 15 years building an organization that ran on the science of knowing who actually held power in any given room. Who had earned what they claimed? Who was taking credit for someone else's work and using institutional authority to cover the evidence? His entire empire, the one nobody at Kessler University had the faintest idea existed, was built on exactly that knowledge. He didn't just recognize what Freud had done to Dalara's research. He had recognized it the afternoon he attended her colloquium, before she even knew his name. He had been watching since then. At 6 o'clock, he asked if she was hungry. She was, extremely, having forgotten to eat since a 7:30 breakfast. They walked to a Korean restaurant 20 minutes from campus, and the conversation continued without pause, shifting from phonological theory to the experience of doing fieldwork in communities skeptical of academic researchers. She told him about recording sessions where people had initially refused to speak naturally because they feared being judged, the way she had learned to sit with that discomfort rather than rushing past it. Presence, he said. You learned that the research required your presence, not just your methods. Exactly. And then, before she could stop herself, most of my colleagues here treat research subjects as data sources. They don't consider what it costs someone to let a stranger study the way they talk. A pause. Then, does your supervisor consider it? The question arrived without agenda, but her hesitation was a half-second too long, and she watched him notice it. My supervisor has different priorities, she said. He did not press, but she saw his eyes return to her face with the quality of attention that shifts when someone has noted something they intend to return to. The next morning, she opened her laptop in the postgraduate reading room and stared at what she already knew she would find. The Foray Abstract. International Symposium on Language and Identity. Second day, morning session, prime slot. His name. Only his name. Her framework underneath it like a foundation he had dug up and relocated. She made one critical error in her first year at Kessler. She trusted the Swiss institution. She believed that work this original, this precise, would speak for itself, that no one with any real standing in the field would risk dismantling a doctoral student's intellectual property for personal gain. She was so wrong it had cost her 18 months of her life. She was about to close the laptop when her phone buzzed. A message from Priya, the second-year student. Just so you know, I saw the visiting Korean fellow, Wonsok. He was here at 7 this morning. He had printed copies of your colloquium slides. He was taking notes on them at the reading room table before anyone else arrived. Dalara read the message twice. Printed copies. At 7 in the morning. Taking notes. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she gathered her bag and went back to the third floor. He was already there. Of course he was. The whiteboard had new notation. The fourth boundary tier, extended now into a secondary split for regional dialect variation. He had been working since early morning. The printed pages of her colloquium slides were laid out on the desk beside him, every page covered in his handwriting, and at the top of the first page, in clear, careful English, Voss, D-boundary marking in Jamaican Creole prosody, Kessler Institute Colloquium, October. Her name, her title, his handwriting. She stood in the doorway and looked at it and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, the specific, unfamiliar sensation of being cited by someone who did not have to. You printed my slides, she said. I needed the phonological notation in front of me to test the fourth tier properly. He did not look up from the board. I cited them at the top. I can see that. A framework belongs to the person who built it, he said, still writing. This is not a complicated principle. She came into the room and sat down. She looked at his annotated notes, the precision of them, the scrupulousness of the attribution, the way every claim that drew from her work was marked with her name like a small flag planted in territory he was staking on her behalf. Then she looked at what was in the conference program, Forate's name, and her framework underneath it. And she thought about the gap between those two things. She made a decision. I need to tell you something, she said, about my supervisor, about what's in that symposium program. He set down his marker. He turned to face her. He gave her his complete, unhurried attention. And Dilara Voss, who had been managing her own professional crisis alone for 18 months, told another person the full version of it for the first time. He listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions. Precise and factual, the questions of someone building an accurate picture rather than performing sympathy. When she finished, the room was quiet. Then he said, "How many times has this happened? The removal of your name, not just the framework, other work." 7. Documented instances in 18 months, she said. Possibly more I haven't caught. Something moved in his expression, not visible anger, nothing so uncalibrated. Something colder and more deliberate than anger, the quality of a decision being made. "The symposium is in 3 days," he said. "Yes." "For it presents on the second morning. Prime slot. Yes." Wonsok was quiet for a moment. Then, "The symposium program lists committee members on the back page. There are 3 department heads with integrity committee appointments among the attendees. I need you to tell me, are any of them people Foray does not have a direct professional relationship with?" Dilara stared at him. "Why does that matter?" He looked at her with the level, patient steadiness she was beginning to understand was not passivity but precision. "Because I am going to be in that room when he presents, and I want to make sure the right people are watching when I ask my question. 3 days ago, she had been invisible. Systematically, deliberately invisible. The kind of invisible that a whole institution conspires in, that nobody names, because naming it would require everyone to acknowledge their own participation. 3 days ago, Wonsok had been a stranger at a whiteboard. Now he was sitting across from her planning the dismantling of 18 months of institutional theft with the calm efficiency of someone who had navigated considerably more dangerous rooms than a university conference center. She thought, "Who is this man?" She thought, "I need to find out." She didn't know yet how much that question was going to cost her. 3 days later, the conference room held 60 people. 60 of the most powerful figures in her field. Editors, department chairs, the kind of senior scholars whose endorsements made careers and whose silences ended them. Dilara had found a seat 7 rows back, aisle side, and she had been sitting in it for 20 minutes watching Dr. Ellison. Foray stand at the front of the room with the comfortable authority of a man who had never once had cause to question his right to be there. He was presenting her framework, her 3-tier boundary strength hierarchy, her presuppositions about social register interaction, her 18 months of fieldwork, her theoretical architecture, her language, slightly rearranged, slightly reworded, just different enough to require someone who had built it to recognize it, and just similar enough that recognition was instant and undeniable. His name was on every slide. Hers was on none. She had told herself she would stay quiet. She had run the math again this morning and arrived at the same answer she always did: silence, safety, survival. She had told herself she was only here to witness it, to document it, to file it away as evidence that might matter someday. Then someone sat down beside her. She didn't look immediately. Then she looked. Seo Wonsok sat with his forearms, resting on his knees, his eyes on the front of the room. His expression carried the focused, neutral quality she had come to recognize from their whiteboard sessions, the precursor to an extremely precise observation. He had recognized the framework immediately. She could see it in the slight forward tilt of his posture, in the way his attention had sharpened into something directed and specific. He didn't look at her right away. He watched Foray for 30 seconds. Then he glanced at her, held her gaze for a moment, and said quietly, pitched only for her, "He is presenting your work." Not a question. "Yes," she said. He returned his eyes to the front of the room. She watched his jaw set, slightly, precisely, in a way she had not seen before. Here is what Dilara did not know was happening on the other side of that controlled expression. Seo Wonsok had, in 15 years of running one of Korea's most powerful criminal organizations, learned to read a room the way other people read text. He had walked into this symposium knowing the 3 department heads in the front rows, knowing which one sat on the integrity committee, knowing exactly where the weight in this room was distributed and how quickly it could shift if the right person said the right thing at the right moment. He had also, in the past 3 weeks, come to understand something about Dilara Voss that she had not yet fully understood about herself, that she was the most intellectually honest person he had encountered in a world that ran on the systematic devaluation of precisely that quality. And watching a man stand at the front of a room and deliver her work to an audience that didn't know it was hers, while she sat 7 rows back in silence, produced in him a sensation he could not have predicted and could not dismiss. He was not going to sit here and say nothing. He had known that since the moment he walked in and saw her face. The Q&A began. 3 scholars asked questions. Careful, deferential, the language of people who respected Ferre's standing too much to challenge it. Then Seo Wonsok stood up. He spoke with the measured precision he applied to everything. Voice carrying easily through the tiered room without any effort at projection. He asked Ferre to explain the origins of the 3-tier boundary strength hierarchy. Specifically, what fieldwork had generated the core presuppositions, which variety of English it had been developed from, and how long the theoretical apparatus had taken to build. The room shifted. Not dramatically, not obviously, but Dilara felt it. 60 bodies recalibrating, the subtle collective awareness that the question being asked was not a question. It was a statement wearing a question's clothes. Ferre answered smoothly. He described a process of collaborative intellectual development. Collegial, generous, the kind of characterization that attributed nothing clearly to anyone. Wonsok listened without interrupting. Then he said, I ask because I attended a colloquium presentation at Kessler Institute 4 weeks ago, in which this framework was presented in its complete form, including the 3-tier hierarchy and the presuppositions about social register interaction, by the doctoral candidate who developed it. Her name is Dilara Voss. I have been working with the framework since that presentation and have found it extensible to Korean tonal data in ways consistent with the theoretical depth of work that takes years to develop. Not weeks. 60 people in the room. The silence that followed had mass. The 3 department heads in the front 2 rows turned, almost in unison, to look at the back of the room. At Dilara. She did not look away. She met their eyes, one at a time, with the steady, clear gaze of someone who was done being a ghost. Ferre's smooth expression did not crack, but it shifted. The quiet, catastrophic shift of a man who has just realized the ground he was standing on was not solid. Afterward, in the hallway, Wonsok found her before she had time to decide what to do next. Are you all right? He asked. No professional framing, no academic distance. Just that. Asking about her, specifically. Standing in a hallway with a lanyard around her neck and 18 months of swallowed silence rising in her throat. No, she said. Not entirely. He nodded as if this was the only reasonable answer. Come outside with me. The October air was cold and sharp after the conference building's sealed warmth. She told him everything. Not the compressed version, but the full one. The one with her mother's voice in it. The one with the 17 times she had started to write a formal complaint and stopped. He listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, both about facts. When she finished, they walked in silence for a moment. Then Wonsok said, The woman in the blue jacket. 2nd row, left side. She is Dr. Soo-yeon Hartman, Edinburgh faculty, member of the symposium's Academic Integrity Committee. She turned to look at you specifically when I asked the question. Dilara processed this. You knew that before you asked. I knew it when I walked into the room and saw you sitting alone watching a man present your work. I spent approximately 90 seconds deciding what to do about it. Then I sat down beside you. She stopped walking. He stopped a half step later and turned to face her, and the October wind moved between them, and she looked at him. This man who had read her work until he found what she herself had missed, who had cited her name with scrupulous precision in notes no one had asked him to keep, who had just dismantled 18 months of institutional theft in 4 sentences in front of 60 of the most powerful people in her field. Why? She asked. Not the professional why, the personal one. The specific, quiet why of a person who needs to understand what they mean to someone who has just done something irreversible on their behalf. He held her gaze. The cold air between them was very still. Because, he said, there is no version of academic integrity that permits me to sit in that room and say nothing. The smallest pause. And there is no version of myself that would allow what is being done to you to continue without consequence. Dilara Voss had been erased for 18 months. She had learned to live in that erasure because the alternative had always seemed too costly, too risky, too much to bear alone. She was not, she realized, alone anymore. Don't thank me, he said before she could speak. Don't thank me for telling the truth. Then, come back inside. There is a panel at 2 o'clock. You should present your response to Ferre's session at the open discussion, in your own voice, in front of those department heads. I don't have anything prepared. You have 18 months of work, he said. You don't need to prepare. You need to walk into that room and speak. Somewhere beneath the fear, beneath 18 months of choosing silence, Dilara Voss felt the woman her mother had raised straighten her spine. She looked at his face, at the steady dark eyes and the quiet, unshakable conviction in them. She thought, I think I might be in serious trouble. She thought, good. Okay, she said. And they walked back toward the building together, Seo Wonsok falling into step beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the October cold. The afternoon panel was titled Power, Positionality, and the Politics of Linguistic Legitimacy. 50 people filled the room. The air carried the specific quality of a gathering that had already been talking about something before it formally convened. Corridor whispers, pointed looks, the academic grapevine operating at the speed of collective discomfort. Wonsok handed her a paper cup of water at the door without comment and positioned himself at her side as if this was simply where he stood. You are not beginning the conversation, he said quietly. It has already started. You are entering it. Dr. Hartman, blue jacket, second row, asked the first question. It was directed at a panelist but framed with surgical precision around the ethics of attribution in interdisciplinary development. The room was very attentive. Dilara raised her hand. She stood, and she used her full voice, the uncompressed version, the one she had been shortening for so long that it felt slightly unfamiliar in her mouth, like a room she was relearning the dimensions of. She described the framework, its origins, its architecture, the 18 months of fieldwork that built it, the colloquium where she presented it, the symposium program where she found it attributed to someone else 3 weeks later. She spoke for 4 minutes. She did not stumble. She did not apologize. Her hands were steady. When she finished, the room had the silence of people recalibrating. The moderator said, "Thank you, doctor." "Miss Voss," she said. "Not yet." A ripple through the room. Acknowledgement. Respect. The subtle shift of a space that had just recognized someone it had been underestimating. At the back of the room, Wonsok said nothing. He did not need to. She could feel his attention like a hand placed steadily between her shoulder blades, not pushing, just there. What followed over the next 3 weeks was not quick, and it was not clean, and it was not painless. Dilara filed the formal complaint. She assembled the documentation, fieldwork notes with timestamps, draft versions with metadata, colloquium slides, and Wonsok's own annotated working notes, submitted with his explicit permission, every reference to her framework meticulously attributed to her name from the first day he had encountered it. Independent corroboration, irrefutable. Dr. Hartman had emailed the day after the panel. No commentary, just a name and a contact. A faculty advocate who is quietly, professionally, devastating on paper. Foray's position shifted in 3 stages. First, collaborative intellectual exchange. Then, when the documentation made that impossible, he had believed the framework to be at a more exploratory stage. Then, when Wonsok's dated notes collapsed that account, institutional silence, and a lawyer who billed by the hour. His name was removed from the symposium proceedings. A formal notation was added to his faculty record. The committee recommended a full review of his supervisory practices, but here is what Dilara did not know, what she would not discover until much later, was that the speed of that outcome was not entirely the result of her documentation. Someone had moved pieces in this situation that academic committees did not have the reach to move. She was about to find out who. She found it by accident, 6 weeks after the symposium. She had been researching Kessler's research. Endowments for a funding application. Routine, unremarkable, when a name in a financial disclosure document stopped her cold. ACO Wonsok. Listed as the principal director of a Korean conglomerate called Yeonhwa Holdings, which held a significant research endowment at Vanthorpe University. Established 8 months ago. The same month Wonsok had arrived in England. She read the filing 3 times. She searched the conglomerate, cross-referenced the directorship, found a profile. Sparse, deliberately sparse, the kind of public record maintained by someone who wanted to be findable only if you were looking very hard in exactly the right place. The photograph matched his face exactly. Yeonhwa Holdings was not a linguistics organization. It was a private holding company with interests in financial infrastructure, real estate, and this was where her reading slowed to a halt. What several investigative journalists, in pieces published and then quietly retracted, described as controlling interests in several of Seoul's most significant underworld networks. She sat very still at her kitchen table, the precise man at the whiteboard. The phone turned face down without a flicker. The way he had known exactly which committee members were in that room before she'd said a word about them. The way Foray's position had collapsed faster than any academic process had the infrastructure to move on its own. She thought, oh. Then she picked up her phone and called him. He arrived in under 20 minutes. She had the financial disclosure open on her laptop. She turned it to face him when he sat down. He looked at it. He did not look surprised. He did not look afraid. "How long have you known I would find this?" she asked. "I expected you would find it eventually," he said. "You are thorough. You do not accept surface information. It is one of the things I—" A brief pause. "Respect most about how you work." Is that what this was? Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Research? No. Direct. Immediate. It was not research. Then what was it? He was quiet for a moment, the particular quality of quiet she had learned to read as him receiving something for its full weight before answering. "I came to Kessler to observe an endowment I held there," he said. "I attended your colloquium because it was on the department's schedule and I was trying to understand the environment I was funding. I did not expect—" Something shifted in his expression, the contained flame behind glass moving. To hear a framework of that quality presented by a doctoral student who was clearly not being treated as what she was, I did not expect to recognize in approximately 4 minutes what had been done to your work and who had done it. Because you recognize theft, Delara said. Because you've built your life on knowing the difference between who actually holds power and who is performing it. Yes. And the committee outcome, she said. The speed of it. Was that? The documentation was sufficient, he said. I did not fabricate anything. I did not threaten anyone. I made certain that the right information reached the right people through the appropriate channels, and I did it faster than those channels would have moved on their own. A pause. Your case was not difficult to win. It only required someone willing to carry the weight of it into rooms you could not enter. Everyone who knew Seo Wonsok in his professional life described him the same way. Untouchable, cold. A man whose decision once made was not revisited. A man who moved through the world like a held breath. No wasted motion, no unnecessary exposure, no vulnerability he had not calculated and chosen. That was exactly why the thing happening to him right now, sitting across from Delara Voss while she looked at him with clear, direct eyes and waited for the truth, was something none of those people would have recognized. He was terrified. Not of her. Not of exposure. Of the specific, disorienting experience of being seen accurately by someone whose opinion he had, without quite deciding to, come to care about enormously. I need to understand something, Delara said. The man who has been protecting my name, who sat down beside me in that conference room and refused to be quiet, is also the man running a criminal organization. Yes. Those two things live in the same person. They do. She sat with that. The October night pressed against the kitchen window. Somewhere outside, the courtyard garden was dark and growing slowly. In your world, she said slowly, what you did for me, is that just what you do? Finding imbalances and correcting them because it's how your empire functions? He was quiet for a longer moment than usual. No, he said finally. In my world, I do not intervene in things that do not involve me. I do not extend resources or attention or personal risk toward outcomes that have no strategic value to me. Another pause, and in it, something she had not heard in his voice before. Something exposed, something that cost him. You are not a strategic asset, Delara. You never were. From the moment I walked into that conference room and saw you sitting alone watching a man present your work, every decision I made was personal. Every single one. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He went very still. Then he turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers, deliberate, unhurried. The way everything he did was intentional, the way meaning something and showing it were, for him, the same action. I need to say something, she said, and I need you to let me finish before you respond. He nodded. What you did at the symposium was an act of genuine integrity, and I know it happened before anything else between us was established. I know you would have done it regardless of how this went. She held his gaze. I'm making that distinction because I don't want you to think what I feel is gratitude wearing the clothes of something else. It isn't. They are completely separate things. Something moved through his controlled expression, the curtain shifting in a wind that wasn't expected. What do you feel? He said carefully. When you are with me. She had known the answer for weeks. She had been waiting for the moment when giving it would be a choice rather than a collapse. Like myself, she said. The full version. Not the compressed one I've been running on for 18 months. He stood from the table with the deliberate, unhurried movement that characterized everything he did. No performance of spontaneity, just the direct, honest motion of a person who had decided something and was acting on it. He moved toward her. She stayed where she was and let him come. He stopped close enough that she had to look up slightly to hold his gaze, and she was aware of the warmth of him, the precise gravity of his presence in the small room, and the way every other thing in her field of perception had reduced to peripheral noise. "I have been trying," he said, "to find the appropriate moment to tell you something for approximately 2 weeks. What does the appropriate moment look like to you?" "Like this," he said, "you looking at me without running the math on whether it's safe." She felt that land somewhere below her ribs. "I think about you constantly," he said, with the same direct, unhedged precision he applied to everything. "I have thought about you since the afternoon you picked up that marker. Every time you argue with me, I find myself looking forward to the next time. Every time you are upset, I am aware of it before you say anything. Every time I look at you, I am—" The smallest pause, aware that I have not wanted to stay somewhere this much in a very long time. "That is," she said softly, a very understated way to say something, "enormous." "I am a precise person," he said. "Precision is what I have." "It's enough," she said. "It's more than enough." She reached up and placed her hand against his jaw. He turned his face very slightly into her palm, a small private motion, the gesture of a man allowing himself to be touched rather than managing the experience of it. She felt his breath against her wrist. His eyes closed for just a moment. "Dilara," he said. Her full name, her precise name, every vowel given its full weight, the final syllable unhurried and complete, said the way she had always wanted her name said, like it belonged to the person it described. "Yes," she said. He kissed her. Not urgently. Nothing about him was urgent, because urgency implied insufficient faith in the permanence of things, and Seo Wonsok had a deep and considered certainty about the things he chose. He kissed her with complete attention and unhurried intention, as if she were the most important problem he had ever been given exactly enough time to solve correctly. His hands found her face, and then her hair, the thick, coiled weight of it. And she felt the particular reverence of hands that were learning something new and finding it worth learning. She kissed him back, the full, uncompressed version of herself, the version that had been waiting. She understood now, not just since the whiteboard, but for considerably longer than that. 6 months later, the paper was published in the Journal of Phonological Studies. Authors, Dilara Voss and Seo Wonsok. Her name first. She read the acceptance letter twice at the kitchen table, in the flat they had been sharing for 3 months, with the morning light coming through the window. She could hear him in the other room on a call with Seoul, the Korean of it rising and falling with the rhythm she had spent months studying as data and now lived with as music. She called her mother. Celestine picked up on the second ring. "Baby." The paper was accepted. The silence that followed was the specific, full, chest-deep exhale of a person setting down something heavy she had been carrying on someone else's behalf for a very long time. "Read me the title," Celestine said. Dilara read it. She read the abstract. She read the referee's comment. Genuine originality. Research directions the field had not previously had the tools to pursue. And her mother was quiet through all of it in the way she had been quiet when Dilara was a child reading her work aloud. When she finished, Celestine said, "Your name is on it. My name is first." A long pause. "Your grandmother would have—" And her mother stopped because the sentence contained too much to finish. "I know," Dilara said. "I know." "Tell me about Wonsok," her mother said. In the other room, the call had ended. The silence that replaced it had the particular quality of someone who had stopped working and was listening to see if she needed anything. She had learned to read his silences the way she read data, not for what they lacked, but for what they contained. "He is the most precise person I have ever met," she said. "He doesn't say things he doesn't mean, which means everything he says lands differently. He remembers things I mention once and brings them back in ways that show he's been thinking about them since. He disagrees with me regularly and I am never insulted by it, which I did not know was possible. She paused. He treats my voice like it's worth listening to. Every time. As a default. Not as something I have to earn. A pause on the other end. Then, bring him to Baltimore. Delara laughed, full, unguarded, the sound of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to laugh without calculating whether it was safe. That's all you have to say? I also want to discuss the extended boundary tier model in person, her mother said primly. But that can wait until I'm looking at the paper. After she hung up, Wonsok appeared in the kitchen doorway, slightly rumpled from the call, alert in the way that meant he had surfaced recently from somewhere deep. He looked at her face, and the quality of his attention shifted into the question he didn't ask out loud. The paper was accepted, she said. He came to the table and read the acceptance letter on her screen, and she watched his face, neutral, precise, until he reached the referee's comment and the contained flame appeared behind his eyes, and she understood she would spend the rest of her life collecting every version of that expression. I have been thinking, he said, about what happens at the end of my fellowship. She had been thinking about this too, with the careful, measured anxiety of someone who had learned not to assume permanence. My department at Seoul National asked about an extended stay, he said. There are joint arrangements between Seoul National and Vanthorpe. I asked about the process. A pause. I submitted the application 2 weeks ago. I wanted to know it was possible before I told you it was possible. She looked at him across the table, at his hand resting near hers. I know, she said. I'm not asking about the application. She held his gaze. I'm asking about you. He understood the distinction. She could see it in the quality of the pause, the way he received the question for its full weight. I am already staying, he said. I stayed the afternoon you picked up that marker. Everything since then has been the formal process of acknowledging it. The morning light fell across their joined hands, across the acceptance letter on the screen, across the kitchen that had become the kind of home she had not let herself believe was available to her. She leaned across the table and kissed him, not gently, not tentatively, but with the full, unhesitating certainty of a person who had finally found the room she was always supposed to be standing in. He kissed her back, with his hands in her hair and the quiet, absolute focus of someone who was exactly where he had decided to be. And the morning went on around them, and the garden outside the window was growing, and her name was on the paper, and he was staying. She was not gone. She had been here the entire time. He had known it before she did. Some people are erased quietly, and some people find their way back, not through a single dramatic moment, but through the accumulation of small, honest acts of courage. Through the choice to speak when silence felt safer. Through the grace of being seen, fully, by someone who had already decided you were worth the risk of being known in return. Delara found her voice. Wonsok found his home. The man who ran one of Korea's most dangerous organizations had, in the end, been undone by the most quietly powerful thing he had ever encountered. A woman who refused to disappear, and a framework built from the language of people the world had tried to silence. He had always known how to identify what was being taken from someone. He had not expected this time to want to give something back. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel and leave us a comment below. Tell us what hit hardest. We read every single one, and we will see you for the next story.